the Inquisition, the First Crusade, the Holocaust, and World War I began the expelling of the Jews in 1290 and also in 1492. What they're praying for, coming together for this fast is fast for victims of violence taking place in our world, for Yahweh to thwart terrorism, and for families to know who have suffered catastrophe as well, locally amongst us and in our country. So, and then all of you, of course, know next week is what? Yes, don't show up here. We will not be here. So we will be at Tumalo. Site A, which is as soon as you get in, it's there on the right. You will see us because there will be lots of us. Tables will be set up, barbecue will be set up, so you can't miss us. There is a $5 fee for parking, so plan on that. And then if you can bring chairs, towels, sunscreen, $5 for parking. Also, dessert or side, if you could bring those as well. We'll provide the meat and the drinks. So please come. It's going to be a fun time. It's always such a great time to be there together with you guys out enjoying the sunshine and God's beautiful creation. So please join us. And if any of you are still interested in mikvahing and you have not talked to John or Adam yet, if you'd like to mikvah, regular church calls it baptism. So if you are interested in doing that, please talk to John or Adam, and they can get you down. That way we have an idea of how many want to do that, and have a better idea how long that's going to be. So, and that is it. That's all I have. So cool. You are on. Is there anybody here who could run the microphone for questions? Thank you, Bob.
Good morning. We've been working, last week was our first effort to start teaching the book of Revelation. We're going to continue with that today, or I'm going to continue with that today. Let's pray. Father, we come before you. We just thank you for this opportunity to worship you in prayer and in song, and now studying your word, Lord. And I pray that you just fill us with your spirit so we can understand more perfectly, and remove our prejudices that might stand in the way from a better, correct understanding. Father, we just thank you for loving us, and we love and adore you. In your name, amen. Last week, we did kind of an intro on the book of Revelation, and I want to continue with that, and hopefully we'll get started with the first chapter today. In review, we covered last week the concepts that the book of Revelation are built around, one of which is covenant. If you weren't here last week or you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, we have books out on the counter that go through all of this. So the book of Revelation, in fact, the whole Bible, but especially the book of Revelation, is built on covenant. And it's also built on an ancient Hebraic social construct that we call the betrothal. It's different than Western betrothal and marriage. It's a Hebraic cultural procedure. This book is built around that. If you don't know that, before you can understand the book, you have to understand covenant and betrothal. This week, I want to focus a little bit more on that it's a Hebraic book. We'll get to that in a minute. Also, I want to focus on, by the way, you're going to, Jerry, and can you bring my briefcase up? Last week, we talked about that the book, it has two parallel themes, that it's basically a story that, and stay right there, Jerry. I'm going to use you as an example of what not to do. No, I'm kidding. If anybody doesn't have one of these, you'll need these. Keep them, because during this series, we're going to continue to refer to this. Hopefully, you will continue to refer to this again and again. So if you can just pass it out to people that don't have one, I'll keep one for myself so I can learn too. We talked about this construction. I want to delve into that a little bit more so you have the best understanding before we get into chapter 1. So last week we talked about 2 plots in this story that God has built into his final book in the Biple. We talked about how important Rev was, that it brings to a crescendo all the story that came before in the Bible. But there's 2 plots. There's one of our books on the book of Revelation has a title called Two Brides, Two Destinies. And there's a question up here. There are 2 brides and 2 destinies, just like there are 2 plots. These 2 plots, one leads to one bride, the other leads to the destiny of another bride. One is an evil pathway, the other one is a holy pathway. One leads to the bride of God, the other leads to the bride of Satan. He has a bride? Yeah. And he marries her and they live happily ever after. No, he kills her. Where in God's kingdom, what does God do for his bride? He allows himself to be killed, right? So we're going to keep our eyes peeled for 2 plots as we proceed. Last week, we also delved into this, what we call compound menorah, only because each one of the lights on this menorah have been compounded to be a little mini menorah themselves, okay? Now, if you look, you'll notice that there's chapters above and chapters below. The chapters above is the plot that leads to God's bride. The chapters below is the plot that leads to death versus life and Satan's bride, because that's her destiny. Laura, you had a question? Okay. I was sitting back there and I go, it's kind of, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but this menorah is, it represents God, but it also represents man. How many branches are there? Well, there's 6, and then there's a trunk, right? So, and the trunk is called what? Shamash, right? Which is the Hebrew word for sun, which the sun above is a metaphorical representation of the creator God who is light, right? It's interesting to note that when in the temple they needed to light the menorah, because it was in the inner court, they would take the light from the shamash and light this thing from right to left. So they would, from your perspective, it would be they would go this way, right? So on this menorah, the first compound menorah or mini menorah that would be lit would be this one on the right, and then they would proceed up and all the way down here, okay? So, and that's the way the book of Revelation is built as well. It's the same general format. This menorah concept goes way back. Remember, God told Moses to build one of these puppies, not the compound, just the simple one, out of, I think it was 90 pounds of gold. Now think about the skill required to beat 90 pounds of gold into that. How do you make tubes without breaking chunks off and then soldering them on some sort? The guy was inspired. He was gifted, wasn't he? So anyway, man is represented by this as these 6 branches, the number for man, connect into the shamash. And on the shamash were reservoirs of oil. So as man is connected through salvation, through faith, to God, the shamash, what starts to happen? Oil flow. These were hollow. oil would flow through the tubes and come out the top, and from which the priests would light. Thus, man's purpose in life is supposed to be shedding the truth, the plan, the will of God, not ourselves. But we get that mixed up from time to time. I'll talk about that later. So this book, many people understand it incorrectly because they think of it with a Western mind. And the Western mind generally thinks linearly, so chronologically. And there are some linear elements here, but it's not linear as the Western mind wants to interpret it. It's very circular, if you will. Just like the feasts are circular. You celebrate them every year, and each one you celebrate. And just like everything's circular in Hebrew timing as well. The Shemitah, the Jubilee, the Sabbath, and of course the feast. Everything is a circle rather than a linear idea. So what we're going to learn as we delve into some of these events that we're going to spot during the study of these mini menorahs is that we will be able to take, and this is probably the most valuable walkaway from this study you can get. You can take Old Testament and New Testament passages that expound on certain little events that God predicts will happen in the end times, and you can hang them on the timeline, because this is a giant timeline, actually. And we're going to see how this works in some detail. So, for example, we're going to, here in the next few weeks, we're going to study the first mini menorah, but first we're going to study the Shamash, which is the one that's over on the right-hand side on your page, and that there's 7 lights on that mini menorah, and we're going to see that there's 7 letters written to the 7 churches of Asia, and the text reveals and have 7 separate messages to each one of those churches or congregations, actually. But before we get there, there's a section called a Shamash, and it is chapter 1. And then when we get done with that, we're going to be introduced to the trumpets. The seals. There's 7 seals. But before we get to chapter 6, which has the 7 seals, 4 and 5 are the Shamash chapter, or introduction to each one of those 7 sets of events. Okay? The way God has built Revelation is he gives you a preview, an introduction to each mini menorah. That's the primary theme, is the introduction. That's the good news. Then once you work through the good news, chapter 1 in this case that we're almost at, then he reveals the secondary plot, the letters, and then he reveals the good news again, chapter 7. And then he reveals the bad news, the trumpets. And then each one of these sets of 7 has an introductory chapter. We're going to call that the Shamash chapter. That's the way the book's built. It is absolutely consistent from beginning to the end of the timeline. The timeline ends in about chapter 18. After that, it's focused on details about his what's going on in heaven and the 1,000-year reign and the age to come after that age. But during the events that lead up to him coming on a white horse, it's all this timeline that's laid out in this intro chapter and then a chapter that reveals these events. an intro chapter, and then a chapter that reveals more events. And all these events are chronological, okay? So with that in mind, hopefully if you don't understand that, it'll become more clear as we proceed, but I'll continue to remind you as we go. The name, Adam touched on this a little bit last week, the name of Revelation, there's a few names that could be used in Hebrew for this. One is Galah, it means to expose, make naked, reveal, make known. So it's always, like I said, I've been studying this book since I was less than 10, I don't know, probably around 8. By the time I was 16, I had this thing laid out. Now, there was some errors, but I had this thing laid out on paper on this massive, back in those days, we had these cardboard things that were about yay by yay, you know what I'm talking about. And I had them glued together. And I had this whole thing, I don't know if I have them anymore, but I had this whole thing laid out because it is it's very orderly. Unfortunately, it's not as orderly from a Western mind as you might think. From an Eastern mind, it's very orderly. Yeah, there's some verses embedded in the book of Revelation that we'll probably get to, but you know, in Proverbs it says it's the honor of God to hide a matter. It's the honor of kings, and I would insert queens, which we all are, to ignore it. No, to search it out. And many amongst the pre-tribulation rapturous, which means there's a group of people, and it's a large majority of the Christian church today, believe that we're all going to be raptured out of the trouble, which I'm voting for. Unfortunately, I just don't see it in the text. Rats. They I keep going off on these rabbit trails, losing my train of thought. The Christian church has promoted this pre-trib rapture, and the book of Revelation is all about tribulation. So the thesis or the thinking is, well, it's all about tribulation. We're not going to be here. Why study it? How many have heard that? Yeah, many people. I've heard it many times because I love the book of Revelation. When I was a kid, I would continually be confronted. That was thrown in my face again and again and again. And I go, why did God put it in the book then? What is it, for filler? You know, that was my line, you know, and, you know, there was no good response, so I thought I won the argument. But I don't know whether I won or not, but the point stands. Why did God, 1/3 of the Bible is prophetic material, most of which is end times. Why did he, you know, in Matthew 24, the disciples come to him and he said, what are the signs of your coming back? Well, he should have said, if it wasn't important, hey, don't focus on that. Get off of that. Here's what I want you to focus on. No, he spent the next 3 chapters answering the question with metaphors and timelines. In fact, we're going to get to that when we get to the seals, because what he said to them in Matthew 24 overlays perfectly on chapter 6, which contain the 7 seals. The second mini menorah up from the right. Okay, let me jump here. Put it here. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the Hebraic nature of this book. Some scholar did a study that is like, how did they spend that much time to figure out this number? They determined that 68% of the verses in Revelation are either direct quotes or almost so from the Old Testament. So if you're trying to, my typical example is some guy in the 60s. I read all of his stuff. But he had, because he wrote about the book of Revelation. You would all know him if I mentioned his name. And he's still alive. Anyway, I was reading his book and he got to chapter 9. In chapter 9, there's it's the fifth trumpet being blown, right? And an angel falls out of heaven with key to the bottomless pit. And he opens it up, and out come all these locusts, right? Now, my mind's going, okay, in the Old Testament, what are locusts? But where he went was Western eyes. Western eyes, all of a sudden, these locusts are helicopters. I'm going, I don't think so. I think, what are locusts in the Old Testament? It's one of those nasty animals that always get used. It's kind of like snakes. Snakes are never used in a good sense in the Bible. The initial snake and his deeds perpetuate all the way to the end. At the end, there's another big snake. He's called a dragon. And the snake is always referred to Satan or something very evil. So also locusts. And locusts, the typical place you find them is Joel. The book of Joel, remember there's 4 kinds of locusts. And they sweep down upon Israel and consume everything. And it's a description of a war. And in fact, we can take Joel, the entire book, and overlay it perfectly on our compound menorah. We'll do that when we get there. There's all kinds of references. This beast that rises up out of the sea. So do you think he's really going to rise up out of the Mediterranean or the Pacific or the Atlantic or Indian Ocean? No, this book is massively metaphorical. So if you're trying to understand it literally, you're going to miss the mark. This beast, there's a beast in the Old Testament. What is that beast? Well, we see it in chapter 3 in Genesis, right? It's the snake. But we also see it throughout the text, culminating in the book of Daniel. That book is, I've written a whole book on the book of Daniel, is talking about a beast. And it's the culmination. It's a composite beast of beasts. God's king of kings, Satan's the beast of beasts. This beast finally accomplishes goal at the end. He's going to be allotted 3.5 years. And he will rule and reign as beasts of beasts, but he won't call himself that, of course. He'll be calling himself King of Kings, because he's a copycat. He wants to steal God's identity, doesn't he? There's other passages. One of my favorite is in Revelation 16. It says, "Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked and people will not see his shame." What is that all about? That's an interesting passage, don't you think? Well, if you try to understand it from a Western perspective and cultural understanding, you're not going to get there. You're going to go, basically your takeaway is, you better be saved, right? But it's much more deeper than that. This idea of covering, what Paul's really referring to is a couple of things. One, at the temple, the guards at night had a punishment that if they fell asleep guarding the temple walls, they had places all the way. Their punishment, guess what their punishment was? They had to strip down and serve the rest of the night naked. Boy, how would you like that punishment? But on a deeper level, what's it referring to? It goes back to Adam and Eve. What happened to them when they violated covenant? They became uncovered. They became naked. And what did God do? He said, I'm going to give you a promise that someday someone is going to pay the price and cover. But in the interim, I'm going to metaphorically represent what I'm going to do by killing this lamb. That's why he's the capital L, lamb. I'm going to take this lamb, kill it, and use its hide to provide clothing, a covering for you. So really what this is really saying is staying awake or not getting drunk is a metaphorical language in the Bible for being spiritual, keeping your spiritual eyes open. What does that mean? It means maintaining your relationship with God, being strong, talking with God, developing ears so you can hear. That's what staying spiritually awake is. It's not just knowledge, it's relationship, true knowledge, right? All throughout, I said this last week, I'll say it again, just so we have this in our mind. All throughout the Bible, there's a story being told. It's the same story that we just described in the book of Revelation. The difference, the story previous to Revelation is the plan of God being laid out and Satan's strategy to steal your identity and steal your authority. So you follow him and see him as your identity and him as your authority. Where God gave that to you from the get-go, and he says, come follow me. I've now covered over your sins, and now, last 2,000 years, he's removed your sins altogether, and the message is, come be my bride. Well, Satan's got the same message. Follow. How do you follow Satan? Everybody out there is going, I don't follow Satan. How many are saying, yeah, I follow Satan? Yeah, there's no hand going up. I'm talking, I had a bad day yesterday. I'm not talking that. I'm talking habitually choosing to go and make Satan your buddy. How do you do that? It's all about being holy. You can be holy unto God or holy unto Satan. And how do you be holy unto Satan? Thank you. You obey Torah to be holy unto God. You obey whoever you love, right? So your thought life and your actions are the litmus test that God is going to use. All throughout the New Testament, you see this again and again. And at the end, and in Thessalonians, and in Corinthians chapter 3, you see that every time God decides to judge, he's going, okay, what have you done? It's like he's already assumed you're in the kingdom, and he's going, what have you done? There's where the rewards come in. So it's a Hebrew book. If you can't take that away when you read this book, you're not going to understand the majority of it, except maybe on the most simplistic level. But if you want to understand it from a deeper level, you got to climb into the Hebraic, cultural, metaphorical, like there's tons of metaphors. In English, if you got a letter and you were Russian and the letter was written from one of us and we said, boy, when that guy heard that, he hit the ceiling. Well, we know what that means, but the Russian's sitting there going, what? He's thinking of some guy dragging in a ladder, climbing up and pounding on this. What does that even mean? If you approach the book of Revelation, in fact, if you approach the Bible from that perspective, Western eyes, you'll miss so much. But that's one thing Adam and I try to, we're always learning, specialize in, is what's the Hebrew orientation? How did they see things? How did they understand things? How do they understand money, economics, marriage, Uh, punishment, government rule. How did they understand it from a biblical perspective? That's what you need to know. In fact, I've said this many times. Before you read any book in the Bible, Joel or Matthew or everything anywhere else, I believe it's really smart to read about that book before you read the book. So, who wrote it? What was his life like? What era was he? Was he writing in the 6th century BC? What was the government like in Israel? What environment did he write in? That's very helpful because lots of times they allude to their environment and you don't see it. If you don't understand, I understand what he's talking about now. Many people, there's multiple wars. There's 4, actually. 3 that we care about. 1 happens at the end of the 1,000-year reign in the book of Revelation. 3 we care about because they happen in the very end times. But many prognosticators, and when I was young, I scratched my head and I go, God, they would, whenever they saw a war, it was the same war. In fact, you can still see that flavor by Christian authors today. So obviously the world's heating up. In fact, it's heating up very, very fast. There's wars breaking out all over the place. 2 of them this last week, brand new wars just broke out between teeny little countries in Armenia and Azerbaijan or whatever, those 2 little countries. They're fighting neighbors because they don't like the way they part their hair or something. There's always very good reasons why people kill each other. But that's minor compared to the ones we see right over the horizon or the ones that are actually happening right now. But you can see biblical prognosticators that they interpret it, unfortunately, with this monotheistic lens. So as we're building up to this war, what do they see? Oh, it's Armageddon. And when I studied this book, I go, man, that happens at the end. What about this war? And if you look at and study what the text says about each one of these wars, they're completely different. The amount of people that die is different. The way they die is different, and the timing is different. The first war, 1/4 of the population gets killed. The second war, 1/3. And the fourth, well, you know when that happens because God comes on his white horse, and we won't get into the details. What we're going to learn is that there's 3 wars that we can hang on our compound menorah, and we'll learn those locations. And I think why God did it this way is he's built, like I used the metaphor last week of a road map. And he's got road signs from Denver to Bend. Bend is the second coming, right? Of course, that's what it would be. And as we get closer and closer to Bend, guess what? The signs say 500 miles to go, and then 400 and 300. You understand, oh, I see. We're getting closer. We are going in the right direction in time, right? We better be going to Bend, however. Yes.
Interesting you mentioned that about the road map and the signs. When I was over in Germany a long time ago, the way our signs are over here, it shows the next 3 exits. This is the next one, the first one, the second one, the third one. In Germany, they have it done differently. They have it, the first exit is the one listed at the bottom. The next exit in the middle, and the third exit down the road is at the top, and they have it done as so you could view it as if the sign were laying down. If it were laying down, then you'd be coming to this one first, and this one, and that one, but then they take that and they stand it up so you can read it. So people they'd see the sign and, oh, okay, my exit's the third one down, and they miss their exit because of that. So
And they probably are so audacious that they drive on the other side of the road, too, right?
Well, no, in Germany,
Oh, they have it right there? The point I'm trying to
I
make
don't
is
remember now, but yeah.
each culture has their own ways. And if you try to understand the Bible and the book of Revelation through Western, German, or English, or American eyes, yeah, you're going to get some of it, but you're not going to get the meat of the meaning and the intimacy. In my studies in the book, the big book, the Hebrew, when you start digging around in the language, it's much more intimate than the English reveals. It's a good translation, but it's not quite as intimate, is what I've learned. It's the Hebrew, what God is really saying is much more relational rather than what we get from reading the English text sometimes. So we've got 3 wars. We're going to learn there's multiple wars in the Old Testament. There's Ezekiel 38 and 39, Gog and Magog. We're all familiar with that. There's wars in Obadiah. There's wars in Psalms 83. All these are end times. Ezekiel 35, Isaiah 34, on and on. Joel, on and on and on. There's all these prophecies about wars, and they're all end time wars. They're not the same war. Again, just like in Revelation, they have different players. They're all focused on one thing. One thing is in common: Israel. Israel is the attackee. Is that right? Yeah. All these guys are attacking Israel, but they're different guys. It's just the Arabs. Then it's this consortium of people that it's given a beautiful list in Ezekiel 38 of who the allies are of Russia who attack Israel. None of them, except one, none of them include any Arab nation. But in Psalms 83, you have a beautiful list of the Arab nations and peoples that are going to attack Israel in time. Well, how can they be the same war? And then, of course, Armageddon is who? Who attacks Israel at the very, very end? Everybody. The whole world comes, even the kings from the east, it says. There's 3 wars, and we'll easily substantiate that as we go through the text and we start overlaying these with embellishments. I think what God did by giving us the book of Revelation is he gave us an overview to all of the 1/3 of the Bible that's prophetic material, but looks jumbled because it's coming from different prophets as they saw visions and dreams, and they recorded it in their books. And we're sit there looking at them and going, how are these are they the same war? No, they can't be the same. How are they structured? What comes here, there, or everywhere? The book of Revelation gives us the structure and the order of events. So we can put the rest of his instruction into an orderly timeline, if you will. And then, of course, the burning question everybody has is, where's the rapture? And I'll use that word because everybody knows what I mean, but the Bible doesn't call it a rapture. It calls it a harvest, right? We see it in chapter 14, but nobody identifies it there. Why? It's in the wrong spot because all the trouble starts in chapter 6. Okay? That's when the description really gets hot. And 1/4 of the population happens. There's massive deception. There's pestilence, economic collapse. There's plagues, and finally a war. And from all of these, 1/4 of the population dies. So that's tribulational, right? There's nobody that disagrees with that. When we get to that, you'll go, oh yeah, we don't want to be here. So and then we got the trumpets and the bowls and other stuff we'll get into as we proceed. So because the book starts off very quickly with trouble, tribulation, we can't have it at the end. We have to, the rapture, we have to have it at the beginning somewhere. So let's find it somewhere just before the 7 seals are broken. So what do? We find it at the last letter, which is chapter 3 going into chapter 4. And John is taken up to heaven and he sees a vision there. We'll get into that. It's very, very meaningful and very powerful what he sees. But that's the rapture. And so we've studied that and looked at it, and it's John. There's no illusion to, hey, there's another group that's tagging along. It's just John. John gets an opportunity to take a heavenly tour, and God allows him to see some pretty crazy things. Then, if that doesn't work for pre-tribbers, then they go, oh, chapter 6, the first horse rider, the first seal. The first 4 seals are the first 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Okay, that's where that is right there. Because all the seals allow horsemen to start galloping over the earth and cause all kinds of havoc. Well, what's the first horse rider? All these horses have colors and they're riders. The first horse rider and its horse is white. We know God's coming back on a white horse, right? So there he is. Before all the trouble, there's God coming back. When we get there, we will show that this is not God coming back. God does show up in the book of Revelation, coming back on a white horse. But it's woefully in the wrong spot. It's in set 16 at the very end. He's coming back on a white horse. So it can't be that he's not coming back twice on a white horse. He's just coming back once on a white horse. Who do you suspect might be a rider introducing himself to the world, riding on a white horse, looking good? He's got a crown on his head and a bow. You know, God has a bow. You know, this guy has a bow. Who do you think that might be? Yeah, it's the enemy. He's a deceiver. He's going to come and present himself, and we'll get more into this as we go. He's going to come and present himself as God. That's what Daniel chapter 9:27 says. The last verse of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. In the midst of the week, he abominates the temple by doing what? It's what Thessalonians said. It said that he will reveal himself, sit on God's temple, on God's seat in the temple, and proclaim him to be second in the kingdom. No. Master and commander, creator of the universe. He will claim to be Elohim, Yahweh, the real God. That's the con. Let me tell you, and if you keep your eyes peeled, you can see this deception that's being poured out on the earth today in massive quantities. Unfortunately, a lot of people are buying it. Or there's 3 groups. There's people going, I don't think so. And then there's another group going, I don't know, pass the ice cream. And then the third group is, yeah, I'm buying into that. Which group are you in? And what eyes are you looking through to come to that conclusion? My advice is sharpen up your vision and your ears so you can hear God, because the guy that's selling that trash is the deceiver. If you're going along thinking the world's going really good in the right direction, 1/3 of America thinks America's going in the right direction. I'm going, what news are they listening to? So the rapture isn't at the beginning. We don't find it in the beginning of the trouble, which is in the The beginning of the trouble is the 7 seals. We don't find it there. We'll establish that much more firmly when we get to those texts. Where we find it is, take a look at your compound menorah here, you'll find that it's going to happen on the 6th mini menorah from the right. And take a guess which light on that mini menorah. Wild speculation. There's 7 events that are spelled out in chapter 14. We call them angelic proclamations because 7 angels come from the throne of God and they make proclamations into the heaven and on earth. Which do you think would be the rapture? The Shamash. That's the coming of God, the Son of Man, to earth to get his bride. Every time you will get to the 4th one, whether it's the seal, the letter, the trumpet, the thunder, whatever the angelic proclamation, it's always an allusion to God, or in the case of the bowls, it's the allusion, which is the 5th one, it's an allusion to the complete woolly absence of God. Yes.
So I never really put it together before that it was the 6th mini menorah. It just totally makes sense that, of course, it's the Shamash position, but I never thought about it being the 6th. But that also makes sense because the number 6 is the number man was created on. So the number 6 represents man. So who's he coming for? Man, righteous man.
Yep. The Shamash, the light of the world, is coming for man whose number is 6 to save him from his sin. And that will be the big event. And that's the thing God's been working for. He's up there right now wrapping presents with big bows with your name on it. And what's in the box? Immortality and life with him forever in this. I was thinking about it yesterday. I was trying to wrap my brain around it. I failed miserably. What could possibly be it like in the next age? I don't know. But he says it's going to be cool. Maybe the big gulps are bigger. I don't know. But I bet you it's way beyond our imagination, and it's really good. That's what he's wrapping right now if you're in his kingdom. He's got presents for you with your name on it. And when he comes at this 4th angelic proclamation, actually it's the 5th, but he appears in the clouds in 4th, and then there's an angel that comes at the 5th. Reap the earth, for the harvest is ready. Are you ready? Okay. Yeah, it's, as we get towards the end of time, when you read the New Testament authors, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or, the Gospels, or any of their letters, and certainly the book of Revelation, you get the idea that these guys were expecting it to happen tomorrow. How many have picked that up? These guys were expecting it to be like any day. Like when the disciples asked him, hey, when are you going to come back? They were thinking in their day. They weren't thinking, okay, it's going to be 2,000 years. Why would they even care? They would probably go, hey, how are we going to stay alive if we're not fishermen? But no, they were wanting to, because they thought it was going to happen in their day. You read that Thessalonians, when you listen to Paul, he's very now oriented. Like this could happen anytime. Why would God set that up 2,000 years ago to have man expectant any moment? He wants us to be ready And because he's not going to tell us exactly when he's coming back, he wants us to be ready. You know, there's a parable, was it Matthew 25 or 26, of the servant who's in charge of the family, right? Or the household. But he starts thinking that, oh, and the master went away on a long trip, right? And so he starts to think that, oh, he's not coming back, certainly not tomorrow. So eat, drink, and be merry, and let's have a good time, right? And that really ended well. No, it didn't. He was judged and he was thrown. You know, I think there's one of those verses that says there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth for people that, I won't use that phrase, people that aren't focused on their relationship. I think more than ever, we should be more attentive than the first century believers, or second, or third, or fourth. Yeah, they had some of these events talked about by John here in Revelation occurring in their life. Certainly when the temple got destroyed, that was probably a big event in their lives, you think? I mean, if I would have saw that, forget the book of John wasn't written yet. It was written around 92 AD, most people think. You would have said, oh, okay, within the next year, God's got to come back. Because look at what's happened here. God's not going to allow that to happen. And Rome was causing hell in the world. Certainly, some of that might have fit into some of the Old Testament prophecies. Because when war breaks out, what almost always occurs as well? Economic crises, famine, because farmers can't plant. What's going on in Ukraine? A lot of farming? No. Why? Who wants to be out driving their tractor when bombs are blowing up in your field? You know, it's not very. Plus, how do you get your seed? How do you get your diesel? How do you get parts for your tractor? Et cetera, right? So it's very difficult. So what's the ensuing result? No produce, lack of food, famine, starvation, economic collapse because nobody's planting the corn anymore, and thus economic collapse and trouble. After every war, World War II, World War I, all the wars, sometimes they're more local, but in those local areas, same thing. We have the catastrophic events that we're going to see in the seals, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, reoccurring again and again and again. So why didn't people, and they did actually, think this is the end of the world? During World War II, they thought this was the end of the world because there was a lot of elements in the book of Revelation. At the end of World War I, the Great War, they thought it was, the end of the world. Well, why? What makes this any time? It doesn't matter. What matters is, are you ready? Because God expects you to be ready and act like it. And being ready includes to talk about him and be his representative in season, out of season. What does that mean? When it's easy and you're talking with your friends, or when it's not so easy, you're tired and you're hungry and you're talking with people that think you're a kook. That's difficult. Or maybe you're being tried, or maybe you're being persecuted for what you believe at work or wherever. Then it's tough to stand up for God. But all the more today. Yes. Oh. Up. There's a mic back there, I guess.
I just wanted to add this facet to your comment about he wants us to be ready, and we need to be ready. From 1 John chapter 3, Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we shall be. We know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him just as he is. And everyone who has this hope fixed on him, Yeshua, purifies himself just as Yeshua is pure. So there's a holiness that also comes as we not only look for him being ready in the ready position, but in that expectancy, there's something that God does that purifies us to make us ready to receive him because he is the essence of purity and holiness.
Very good. With that, I don't need to even have a conclusion. So. But I still have 15 minutes, so I want to make one more comment, which
John?
that will allow us to start with chapter 1, not next week, because that's Park week, but the following week. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you said that most people say that John wrote Revelation in 92 AD. Just curious, if the temple was destroyed in 70, why didn't he even mention anything about the temple being destroyed?
Because the book of Revelation is different from all the other letters. It's not a letter written by a person that's being inspired by God to write. If you look at like Paul's or the other letters, their recordation of their travels, historical orientations, historical records, and their specific message to a specific congregation in somewhere. Revelation is all about a vision that appears to John. And he's told, we'll get to it in a couple of weeks, he's given very specific instructions about what to write and what not to write. So he's only allowed to write down what he sees and what he hears. Okay? So.
Okay, well, I guess I'm thinking, what do the people who lead, he writes it and the churches and everybody gets a hold of it during that time, and they read it and they talk and they read about the Antichrist is going to, the beast is going to be in the temple and all this other, and they go, well, wait a minute, that can't happen. We don't even have a temple. I'm just wondering, it seems that something would have been put in there, I don't know, about that.
Yeah, it's very well grounded in archaeological evidence. Nonetheless, you have a good point. Nonetheless, it's pretty well established that it was in the 90s AD. But your point is apropos, however. There's a lot of scholars that will late date the New Testament books, Matthew through all the rest of the letters, except Revelation. They will date them post collapse of the temple in 70 AD. Because what's their motivation? The further you can get a recordation of history written from the date that it happened, the more trash can filter in. And that's ubiquitous on ancient documents. So most ancient documents, like I've said many times, Alexander the Great, the soonest date, the soonest record we have is 300 years after the events. How many things snuck in there that didn't actually happen? Well, 300 years worth of time allows some. So scholars, especially atheistic biblical scholars, sounds like a non sequitur actually, doesn't it? Try to late date everything. They'll put it in the early 2nd century, mid 2nd century for most of these books. It's like, what? But your comment is a powerful argument. That being, if the temple would have been destroyed, none of these guys would have recorded that event in their letters or in their gospels, you'd think. And especially, they would have gone, look, Yeshua prophesied this was going to happen. And here, that's even more evidence that his claims are true. But nobody used that argument. Why? Because all the books, in my opinion, all the books were written before 70 AD. And now what's being discovered, I've talked a little bit about this in the past, so I won't go into it at all. But now what's being discovered is most of these books were written between 45 and 65. If you look at your compound menorah chart here, has anybody counted up how many lights there are? I mean, you don't have to count them up. There's 7 of them, and each one has 7. So take out your pen and paper and go 7 times 7, and what do you get? 49. Now, does that mean anything biblically? Westernized, no. 49 is the number before 48. But in the Bible, what's 49? It's a jubilee, right? Every 50th year. And it's 49 years because the first year of a jubilee period is the jubilee. So it's 49 years, right? So this whole thing is built around Shemitas. Remember, every 7 years, you were supposed to let the land rest. And then after 7 Shemitas, it ends with a Shemitah year, so you let the land rest. But then the 49th year is a Jubilee. And what do you do on a Jubilee? You let the land rest again. So God told the Israelites, he said, if you obey me, I will give you 2 years, a crop that'll last you for the 3 years you'll need from the Shemitah year of rest and the Jubilee year of rest, and get you through that whole cycle 2.5 times, because the harvest would occur in the middle of the next year. He said, I'll do that for you if you follow my instructions. So this thing is built around the Old Testament time frame. I have never, it's pretty obvious, don't you think? I have never heard anybody see this little bit of insight that the book of Revelation is built around this Jubilee concept. So I've been, me, I love this kind of study. So I've been studying. We know what the Shemitah year is. We're in one right now. This is the 7th year in a Shemitah cycle, okay? So my little mind, I want to know when the Jubilee is. Unfortunately, we've lost it. Okay, the rabbis stopped recording it once the temple was destroyed, and previous to the temple destruction, they alluded to it almost not at all. So we don't have any documents, except that there's a few that now have been discovered. And somebody that was really smart discovered that it's alluded to in Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 1. We won't have time to get into that. But if you do the math, it's a Jubilee. Well, how do you do the math? It's like 574.5, okay, right in there. Ezekiel was one of the prophets that prophesied during the exile period for Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar exiled the Hebrews. He lived and prophesied in that time period. So you have to know that the start period was, God told them, when you enter the land, start the Shemitah cycle. So when did they enter? 1408, 1407. You take that year, because their year starts at the end of our year and goes to almost the end of the next year. Okay, so it's 1408, 07. Okay, so if you start then and I've done the math. Thank God I had a calculator. 7. It'll eventually, if you add the 1, because there's no year 0, right? Guess what is the Jubilee? Now, this isn't because of my great knowledge. I've actually read other people that are way smarter than me that have done this and discovered this. In fact, they've discovered some ancient writings that come out of the 11th century BC that referred to a Jubilee year. I forget the year. Forgive me, I just haven't recorded in my little pea brain. And somebody wanted to verify it based on the 1408, 1407 year. Boom, 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 boom. And they did math, 49. That year was a Jubilee. And they kept going. And the Ezekiel year of 574.5 was a Jubilee. So it got verified. Okay? So they went forward in time. And it's funny. I've read, I can eliminate 6 out of 7 years. Every 6 or 7, I can eliminate those years. How can you do that? A Jubilee is never going to fall on a year that isn't followed by a Shemitah. So like I read multiple places, 2017 is a Jubilee. I go, well, that means 16 has to be a Shemitah, right? Well, 16 wasn't a Shemitah, 14 was. So it could have been 15, but not 17. And I've heard 18 and 19. It's not that I'm smart, I just know it has to follow a Shemitah, right? A Jubilee. So guess what 2223 is? A Jubilee. Based on the math. Now, I used to think that that's when God's coming back. So pack your bags. No, you don't even need to worry about that. He's got everything in these little bundles wrapped up in heaven for you. You don't have to worry about your bags. But what that metaphor means is, are you ready? Another little fun fact. So I go, okay, I wonder, in God's timing, you'd think things would make magic, and I mean that in a spiritual sense. So I go, I wonder how many how many Jubilees there was from 1408 when the Jubilee Shemitah cycle started. You'd think it'd be something that means something, right? Well, this, starting on Yom Kippur this year, October eve of the 4th, happens to be, since the start of counting Jubilees, this is the 70th. Now, why is 70 of any value? Because what does 7 mean? Completion, perfection. Is God completing and perfecting his timeline? I don't know, maybe. I think that this next year could have some very interesting things occur. What they might include, I don't know. I could guess. But I think that the fact that things are the way they are in the world certainly would make us, I'm going to be a little more sensitive and have big elephant ears in the direction of God, wherever he is, right? I want to hear what he's saying. I'm going to have my radar on. This might be a time to be more focused, get your things in order. It's kind of like when you're my age, you make sure you have a will, and you think about who's going to be the inheritors, whether they're good, bad, or no. You get your household in order. Is your household in order? We talked about this menorah and how it's a super structure, but it's not a lot of detail. As we read these events, good and bad, that are going to be poured out, sometimes literally onto the earth, we don't get a lot of detail. It just says, yeah, there's a red horse rider, he's going to take peace from the earth. Well, okay, what? What does that mean? And then the next one, somebody, there's not a lot of detail, but there is an order. Here's where the red horse, and we'll talk about why it's red. It's not China, because they're the red Chinese. Western eyes, right? You have to think Hebrew eyes. And we'll get into Hebrew eyes later. There's little detail. There is some. When we get into some of the trumpets, the last three, called the three woes, which sounds like a lot of fun. There's a little more detail, but it's extremely metaphorical. It's like, what in the world is going on here? But it does give you enough metaphorical information to understand, there's something going on here we'll get into the specifics. There's a war happening, and here's how they die, and here's the response of the people that remain. They all fall down and worship God. Sorry, that isn't what happens. There's some things that are going on behind the scene that John is trying to describe that we'll never see. We're never going to see an angel fall out of heaven with a key to the bottomless pit. Okay? But that's what's going on in some of these things. Some of this is very spiritual. But what we can do is we can see this structure and order of end time events. And God gives us enough keys, enough information to grab Ezekiel 38. Everybody knows the Gog and Magog war, right? Everybody's heard of that. Ezekiel 38, 39. It is 2 chapters describing the exploits of these attackers and how it impacts Israel, where they die, what they die from, and how God saves Israel because they're overwhelmed. It talks about the allies, what's the political situation going on in Israel, what's Russia's orientation, what their leadership, a lot of details. Very fascinating. There's keys that we can link to know where that hangs onto this compound menorah. And when we get there, I'll expound on that. Each one of these are events that allow you to hang all these things like in the New Testament. Thessalonians talks about the second coming of God. We can hang it right on here. It talks about certain deception that's going to come. We can hang it right on here. The Gog-Magog war, we'll be able to hang it right on this structure. So we'll know that we're getting closer and closer to Ben. And then we'll know, okay, what's next? Well, Revelation says this is next. And then there's an Old Testament prophecy that expounds on that. So what it does is it gives us this is kind of like an index in a book without the chapters. It's just the index. The chapters in the Old Testament and other prophetic material in the New. That you can hang on. So instead of just reading 22 chapters, you've got mountains of end-time prophetic material that you can lay out in this structure. So I'm out of time. I'll end with this. As the menorah is God's structure and plan, so also does the menorah represent you and me, mankind. And when I was sitting back there, it dawned on me, and I'll reveal some things next week that dawned on me. But what also dawned on me was, the book of Revelation is showing where to hang stuff. It's so valuable that God has created this structure that we can take other texts of the Bible and place them in this order. And I'm going, are we getting our lives the same way? God wants to hang all kinds of, he just doesn't want to have an index. Oh, here's John Klein. All I've got is an index. These are all the things I wanted, but there's no specific information because what's the holdup? God? Probably not. It's probably us. Is he able to hang? What's he want to hang on you? Weights so you're bogged down? No. Life, gifts, talents, opportunities, blessings. Everything we want, he wants to hang on us. What prevents God from doing that? The same answer to that question is the same answer to this question. Why don't you give your 3-year-old child a car? Not ready. This is not because of we're not old enough. Everybody sitting here is old enough for God to hang tons of things on. But he waits on us because we would just wreck the car if he gave. He wants to give us these boxes that he's got wrapped up right now. Some of them anyway. But we haven't decided to connect too much of our life into him, into the shamash. So we're flowing more in his spirit. We're flowing more in our flesh. So the question is, to get ready, take a look at your life and analyze it. Is that kind of biblical? Does God ever ask you to do that? Does he ever ask you to do that? I think this is a good time in history for us to copycat what the ancients did as well. They were expectant that God could come back anytime, so they made themselves ready. Like Paul writes, he said, all of these patriarchs died without receiving the gift. What's the gift? His return, immortality, right? The good news, right? But they were all expectant, waiting, and in the process of being expectant, like if you're going to go on vacation, what do? You get ready. You get your suitcase out, you get make sure you have reservations, you spend most of your money at home, right? And you look at your suitcase, maybe you need to buy a new one. You make sure all the stuff that you need is in it. And because you know time's coming when the plane departs. Is that how we're approaching? So many of us, including myself, we get bogged down. And God understands, but he allows people like me to rattle our cages from time to time. We get caught up in the daily life and we get focused on things that are meaningful, but they can become distractions from the real cause. And the real cause is getting ourselves into shape so when the plane departs, you're at the airport. So, how many of us are at the airport? Let's pray. Father, we come before you. We thank you for that you care for us, that you died on the cross for us. And Father, I pray that you would just instill in us a new heart to want to draw closer to you, to be mindful, to take you with us wherever we go. Ask you questions about ourselves and how we can please you more, how we can hear from you more clearly. Father, I pray that as we learn Revelation, that it's not just a study on some informational text in the Bible, but it's heartfelt, and we feel moved to instill in us a new heart, a new motivation, a new focus on you. Because whether the times are short or not, it's always a good time to be expectant. And sometimes even that expectancy might be misdirected. It's still what you want us to be focused on, which is what you want in our lives. Father, so I pray that you continue to work in our minds and our hearts to hear your direction and how we might live to please you. We love and adore you. Amen.
Please rise.
Please rise for the Aaronic blessing.
Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha Ya'er panav elecha v'yihuneka Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yisen lecha shalom v'yisen lecha shalom. This is the way you shall be blessed from day to day. He'll be your rest.
May the Lord bless and keep you. May his grace and his face shine upon you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
And give you peace.
And give you
give you peace.
Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat shalom. Hey!
Join me with the prayer over the bread. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lehem min haaretz. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Shabbat shalom. Have a wonderful day.